You've felt it. That sense, even on an ordinary day, that things are moving faster than they used to, that the news cycle never actually rests, that something underneath the surface of normal life has quietly picked up speed. You cannot always name it. You just notice it, usually late at night, scrolling past one more headline that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago and now barely holds your attention for a second. The Bible named that exact feeling 2,000 years before you had it, and it did not name it once. It named it 7 times, in a single conversation, on a hillside outside Jerusalem, in an answer so specific that most people who quote it have never actually read all 7 signs in order. And the 7th one, the one most people skip past entirely, is not what you would expect at all. This conversation is not buried in some obscure corner of the text. It sits in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, one of the most central chapters in the entire New Testament, spoken directly by Jesus himself in response to a direct question from his own disciples. This is not a passage describing something that already happened in the past, filed away as ancient history. The text is explicit that it describes what is still ahead, what the disciples would not live to see completed, what every generation since has had to read and ask the same question about. When something this central to the text gets this specific about a list, it is worth actually going through the list. Most people who reference this chapter reference it in fragments, a phrase about wars, a phrase about earthquakes, pulled out and repeated without the order or the context the disciples actually heard it in. They asked a direct question, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world?" And Jesus did not answer with a single sign or a vague mood. He answered with a sequence, one item building on the next, ending in a place almost no one quoting the chapter ever seems to arrive at. Going through it in order the way it was actually spoken changes what the whole passage sounds like. Before this goes further, one quick thing. Have you felt that sense of speeding up sometime in the last year? Just yes or no in the comments. I read everyone. And it helps to know how many of you are noticing this before we even get to what the text says about it. And if this is the kind of thing that makes you want to open your Bible again and actually read it slowly, subscribe. There is another sign, another chapter coming next week, and this channel exists to walk through them one at a time instead of rushing past them the way most people do. The first sign is deception wearing a familiar face. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 and 5, Jesus opens his answer with a warning before he gives a single sign, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." Notice what he does not say. He does not say beware of people who reject him. He says beware of people who claim him, who use his own name to gather followers around themselves. In real life today, this rarely looks like someone literally claiming to be a returned Messiah, though that has happened more than once. It looks like certainty sold with religious language, a leader or a movement that borrows the authority of faith to demand a loyalty that faith itself never asked for. It is easy to miss because it wears the right vocabulary. The warning is not against unbelief, it is against belief pointed at the wrong center. This sign is easy to misapply in 2 opposite directions, and both are worth naming before moving on. Some people apply it too narrowly, picturing only a single individual on a world stage making an explicit claim to divinity, and because no one that obvious has appeared, they conclude the sign has not yet started. Others apply it too broadly, treating every confident religious leader as automatically suspect, which the text does not support either. Jesus is not warning against all leadership, only against leadership that borrows his specific name and his specific authority for a purpose the text calls deception. The narrower reading misses the sign because it is waiting for something cartoonish. The broader reading misses it because it stops trusting anyone at all. The actual sign sits between those two, and it asks for exactly the kind of attention this whole passage keeps returning to. The second sign is the sound of distant conflict that never quite goes away. Verse 6, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." This is worth sitting with, because Jesus says the opposite of what you might expect. He does not say war is the sign the end has arrived. He says war and rumor of war will simply be the ongoing background noise of the age. and he explicitly tells his listeners not to be troubled by it, as if each new conflict were the final one. In real life today, this is the reflex of watching a new headline about conflict somewhere in the world and feeling the private thought, is this the one? Is this finally it? The text anticipated that exact reflex and answered it 2,000 years in advance. Not yet, it says. Keep going. This is one of the easiest signs to get backwards, because the instinct when watching conflict on a screen is to treat the most recent one as uniquely significant, worse than anything before it, surely the one the text was pointing toward. The text preempts that instinct directly rather than leaving it unanswered. It does not deny that the wars are real or that they matter to the people living through them. It simply refuses to let any single one of them carry the weight of being the sign, because the pattern it describes is ongoing and repeated, not a single climactic event. Missing this sign usually does not look like ignoring war. It looks like being told, every few years by every generation, that this particular war is the one, found either believing it every time or growing so numb to the claim that the actual pattern underneath stops registering at all. The third sign moves from human conflict to the instability of the earth and the body itself. Verse 7, "For nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places." 4 different categories in a single verse: political division, hunger, disease, and geological instability, all named together as one connected pattern rather than 4 separate coincidences. This is easy to overcorrect on in both directions. Some treat every earthquake and every outbreak as individual proof the end has arrived. The text does not support that reading, because verse 8 calls all of this only the beginning of what it calls sorrows, using a word that in the original language means the first contractions before a birth, not the birth itself. In real life today, this sign is not a specific headline. It is a pattern of frequency and simultaneity. The sense that instability is arriving in the world and in the body at the same time, in more places than used to feel normal. This sign is missed most often by people living somewhere comfortable, because famine, disease, and earthquake can sound like something that happens elsewhere, to someone else, on a continent, far from the one watching this video. But the text says in divers places, not in one place, and the pattern it describes is about simultaneity and spread, not about any single location being uniquely marked. It is also missed by the opposite kind of reader, the one collecting every disaster report as private proof, treating a normal news cycle as if it were accelerating just for them. The text gives a name for that instinct too, calling it only the beginning, a phrase that assumes the sign continues without being the finish line itself. The 4th sign turns personal, and it is the one people are often least prepared for. Verse 9, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake." This is not a sign about the world in general. It is a sign about what happens specifically to people who hold to this text seriously, and it promises hostility, not popularity. In real life today, this rarely looks like formal persecution in most places watching this video. It looks smaller and more social. The quiet cost of being visibly serious about faith in rooms where that seriousness is treated as strange or embarrassing, and the discomfort that comes with realizing the text never promised this would be easy or well received. This one is easy to miss for a specific reason. It does not feel dramatic while it is happening. There is no single moment of open persecution to point at, no clear headline. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of small social costs, a meeting where faith is mentioned, and the room goes quiet in the wrong way. A relationship that cools a few degrees once it becomes clear a person takes this seriously rather than casually. The text does not promise that this sign will always look like the dramatic hostility of earlier centuries. It promises hatred for a specific reason, for my name's sake, and hatred scales to whatever a given culture considers acceptable to express, sometimes loudly, and sometimes as something closer to quiet exclusion. The 5th sign is internal to the community itself, not external pressure from outside it. Verse 10, "And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." This is the sign people are most reluctant to apply close to home, because it is easier to picture enemies from outside than fracture from within. The text is specific that this offense and betrayal happens among those who were, at some point, close enough to betray, not strangers. In real life today, this looks like division inside communities that once held together, disagreement escalating into contempt between people who used to share the same room and the same convictions, a coldness that starts inside the circle before it ever reaches the edge of it. This sign is often missed because it is more comfortable to imagine betrayal coming from outside a community than from inside it. It is easier to brace for an external threat than to notice contempt growing between people who once shared genuine closeness. The text does not soften this by locating the fracture somewhere abstract. It says one another, twice in the same sentence, insisting that this specific sign is measured by what happens between people who were near enough to hurt each other in the first place. The sixth sign follows directly from the fifth, and the text ties them together in the very next breath. Verse 11 and the first half of verse 12, "And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. This is the sign that has nothing to do with the sky, nothing to do with war or weather, only with what happens to affection itself under enough pressure and enough deception." It is worth naming here, even briefly, because leaving it out of a list of 7 signs would misrepresent the text. But it deserves its own full hour, which this channel has already given it elsewhere. Here, simply notice that the text puts a relational and emotional sign in the middle of a list most people expect to be only about disasters. Cold love is named as seriously as earthquake and famine. This sign is easy to miss for the opposite reason of most of the others. The first 5 signs are visible, external, the kind of thing a news camera could capture. This one is internal and gradual, a temperature dropping so slowly that no single day feels like the day it happened. Someone can wake up cold toward things that used to move them and never be able to name the morning it changed. The text pairs this directly with false prophets and abounding iniquity, suggesting the coldness is not random, but a response to pressure and deception applied over time, which is exactly why it is so easy to mistake for simple exhaustion instead of naming it as a sign at all. The 7th sign is the one this video exists to correct, because almost everyone who quotes this chapter stops one verse too early. Verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." Read that again. After 6 signs that sound, on the surface, like a catalogue of danger and difficulty, the 7th sign named by the text is not a disaster at all, it is a completion. It is the good news reaching every nation, everywhere as a witness, and only then, the text says, does the end come. Most people who fear this chapter never get to this verse because they stop reading after the wars and the earthquakes and assume the whole passage is a countdown to catastrophe. It is not. The final named condition before the end, according to the text itself, is not collapse, it is reach. That is the sign almost everyone misses, and it changes the entire tone of everything that came before it. Think about what this does to the 6 signs that came before it. Read alone, false Christs, wars, famine, persecution, betrayal, and cold love sound like a countdown, with nothing but loss at the end of it. Read with the 7th sign attached, they sound like something else, like conditions surrounding a specific kind of completion, the way pressure and difficulty surround the final stage of almost anything that is actually being finished rather than simply destroyed. The text never asks the reader to feel only dread. It asks the reader to notice a pattern that ends, according to its own words, with something reaching everyone rather than something ending everyone. This is also the sign hardest to verify by simply watching the news, because it does not photograph well. Wars are visible, earthquakes are measurable. The reach of the gospel across languages, regions, and generations that once had no access to it at all is a slower, quieter kind of evidence, the sort of thing a person only notices by comparing decades rather than headlines. It is easy to miss precisely because it does not arrive as breaking news. It arrives the way most real completions do, gradually, until one day the condition the text named has simply become true. Lay the 7 side by side and a shape appears that gets lost when each one is quoted on its own, the way headlines and sermons usually quote them. The first three signs, false messiahs, war, and the instability of the earth, describe pressure coming from outside a person, from the world at large. The next three, persecution, betrayal, and cold love, describe pressure landing inside a person, and inside the relationships closest to them, the exact places pressure is hardest to bear because there is no distance from it. And the seventh breaks the pattern entirely, moving past pressure altogether into something being finished. 6 signs of mounting difficulty, both outward and inward, followed by 1 sign of completion. That is the actual architecture of the passage, and it is very different from the flat list of disasters most summaries reduce it to. Everything up to this point has been about the world outside your window. 6 signs pointing outward at conflict, instability, hostility, fracture, and deception, and a 7th pointing at something being completed rather than something breaking down. What comes next is about you specifically, reading this list right now. There is a difference worth naming between reading this list the way most sermons present it and reading it the way it was actually asked for. The disciples did not ask for a warning to fear. They asked for a sign to recognize, the same way a farmer recognizes a season changing without needing a calendar to confirm it. Everything Jesus lists after that question is answering exactly that request, not building a case for dread, but handing over a set of things to watch for, so that whoever is paying attention will not be the one caught off guard when the pattern completes. The text is clear about one more thing, more clear than most preachers manage to be. In the same conversation, a short while later, Jesus says this, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Not the angels, not the disciples asking the question, not anyone reading this now. So this is not a countdown, and it was never supposed to be one. Anyone who claims to have calculated the date is contradicting the very text they claim to be following. 7 signs were given. A date was withheld on purpose by the same voice that gave the signs. So what does someone do with 7 signs and no date? Not panic, because panic is what the text explicitly tells you not to do in verse 6, when it says, "See that ye be not troubled," not calculation, because the date was deliberately withheld from everyone, including the angels. What is left is something quieter and more useful than either of those, which is attention. Recognizing the pattern the same way you would recognize weather changing before a storm, not to predict the exact minute it arrives, but to be someone who is not caught by surprise when it does. That is the difference the text seems to be drawing between the ready and the unready, and it has nothing to do with knowing a date nobody was ever given. Notice, too, what attention without a date actually changes in an ordinary week. It does not add a task to a list or a countdown to a calendar. It changes how a person reads a headline about conflict, without either panicking or going numb. It changes how a person notices coldness creeping into a relationship, catching it early instead of waking up one day, wondering when it happened. It changes how a person hears about faith reaching somewhere it never had before, seeing that not as background trivia, but as part of the same pattern named on that hillside 2,000 years ago. None of this requires knowing what day it is. It only requires knowing what to watch for, which is the entire point of being given 7 signs and no clock. Go back to that feeling you started with, the sense of things speeding up on an ordinary day, scrolling past one more headline that would have stopped you cold a decade ago. That feeling has a text behind it now, 7 signs deep, written long before you were born, ending not in collapse, but in the world actually hearing something it needed to hear first. You are not required to have a theory about the calendar. You're only required to notice the pattern, the way the text asked you to, and to remember that the last sign named was never the disaster people assume it was. Tell me in the comments which of the 7 landed hardest for you, in one word if that is all you have time for. If this made you want to open the text again and read it slower than usual, subscribe because there is another sign waiting next week, one this video did not have room for. 7 signs, spoken in one sitting, on one hillside, to a small group of people who had no idea how long the wait ahead of them would actually be. Every generation since has read this same list and asked the same private question. None of them were given the date. All of them were given the pattern, the same pattern sitting in front of you right now. The text did not hide these 7 signs. It simply asked, from the very first verse, that you pay attention. Now you have.